Hi, and welcome to a brief explanation of some of the major issues and events that kind of preoccupied Stalin during the time period between, say, 1928, 1929, when he was clearly already first among equals, say, among other Bolsheviks, up till the time when Stalin was clearly unassailable. He was firmly in power, and no one could touch him in 1936, 37, 38. And the first major issue that Stalin took up after he was clearly the main leader of the Soviet Union was industrialization, and this is linked with the abandonment of NEP, the new economic policy, because it was by abandoning the new economic policy and really putting the government in charge directly of the agricultural sector of the economy that Stalin was able to gather the funds to really pump resources into industrialization. So this was only possible once NEP was done away with, and that happened around 1928 with the defeat of Bukharin. So during this time period, in the years leading up to 1928, there had been a major threat of war with France and with Britain especially. I think ambassadors had been recalled. There were a lot of people expected some kind of invasion of the Soviet Union. So Stalin and the other top communists realized that they really needed to get their military-industrial act together if they wanted to be able to take on the West. So Stalin in particular set extremely high goals for a plan of basically having a state-run, like fully state-run economy in the industrial sector for 5 years at a time, and goals would be set 5 years in ahead. Production would be coordinated through the center, through Moscow, and resources could be channeled into the sectors that the government thought were most important. And in the first 5-year plan, these included mostly heavy industry, things like coal, iron, steel, oil, electricity output, machine parts, all things that Stalin and the leadership wanted to emphasize. And this would change for other 5-year plans. Let's see. So the state Gosplan was the state organization in charge of this, although there was some competition between different state plans. Now, how were the Soviets expected to achieve this? That's a fair question. A 300% increase in anything, much less in all industrial production across the board, is pretty hard to do. One of the ways this was that the state pushed this was by through basically propaganda, through idealizing, taking these very productive workers, and the most notable one was a guy named Andrei Stakhanov, who was a coal miner. In one shift, he famously dug out 14 times the normal expectation for a normal worker in this coal mine, and so feats like this were played up by the press. Although, of course, it turned out that he and other people who came in his footsteps and were trumpeted as national heroes. Generally, the books were cooked. Other people were helping them. It was not one worker is not 14 times better than another worker. But that was what the propaganda. That's what the propaganda told the Soviet people. And there were obviously a lot of problems with any kind of plan like this. It's incredibly inflexible. If you set your goals 5 years out, if you're trying to coordinate things from, say, Moscow, that might be happening in southern Georgia, you're pretty removed from the decisions that need to be made on the ground. So there was huge inefficiency in terms of things like this. Also, a lot of the reports were falsified. The books were cooked because economic managers knew that if they did not report having, say, upped their production by 350% of coal, well, they would probably find themselves in pretty serious trouble, maybe in prison somewhere, relieved of duty, something like that. So they would report to Moscow that all was going well. They had passed their objectives, when in reality they had just sent a train, 1/4 filled with shoes to Kharkov or something like that. So the problems kind of built on themselves. You had a lot of imbalances because if you're prioritizing one thing, in this case coal, oil, etc., you're going to deprioritize something else, and what was often deprioritized was consumer goods, things like housing. There was kind of a baby boom during this time period. Transportation had trouble kind of keeping up with all of the newly produced goods that needed to be transported here or there or everywhere around the country. So these created more issues. You had a lot of the period of the 5 different 5-year plans overlapped with periods of severe repression and arrests, executions, purges, all of these things that removed the most important technocrats and officials from the economy. So that also turned out to be a problem. And continuing with the changing goals of the 5-year plans, the last 2 5-year plans, which occurred beginning in, I believe, in 1946, after the Second World War ended, were largely attempts to redress the damages caused by the war, and after that to build up industrial and military capacity to fight the Western capitalist powers in the Cold War. So all in all, the 5-year plans, there were a lot of problems with them. The statistics we have about them are in a lot of ways unreliable. But it is fair to say that to some extent the 5-year plans achieved what they set out to achieve. The USSR did more or less turn into a serious industrial power during this time period. However, there was a huge human cost, massive suffering, and the industrial, especially given what we're about to learn in our next section, advances in the industrial sector may have been even more than balanced out by destruction in agriculture. So, collectivization. The idea of collectivization is, well, you just break down the word, is just bringing together farms, in this case, that used to be separate, individually run farms, and turning them all into one giant beehive-like collective farm, one group farm. This is it kind of goes hand in hand with a lot of socialist ideas, and Stalin and the other top communists turned towards it, especially after the those on the right end of the Communist Party, namely Bukharin and his allies, were dealt with, were relieved of most of their top posts after 1928, 1929, and there were a series of bad harvests, a grain crisis that left the cities hungry again, like in the bad years of the war, the World War I and the Civil War. So the state eliminated the individual farms that had begun to grow up after the end of war communism, and these were replaced by collective farms. You would have many families brought together, potentially uprooted from where they used to be, no regard towards who was good at what, who was, say, a bad farmer, but they would somehow be expected to manage their affairs communally. Obviously with the guidance / enforcement of state officials. And these are called kolkhozes. There was obviously a lot of people were going to be against this idea, especially the most productive and most skillful farmers who had done pretty well under NEP. And these, you may remember, these people were called kulaks, very derisively. It was very, very bad to be a kulak because then you were just kind of like a capitalist Western agent out on the farm, which, it's not good to be an internal enemy when Stalin is your leader. So these resistance was basically met by massive violence. Stalin called famously for the liquidation of the kulaks as a class, which sounds pretty bad. They were basically kind of put through the blender. They were arrested. They were deported. Many, entire villages could just be uprooted and sent to the far north, to Siberia, to anywhere where either some kind of production could be squeezed out of the land where there currently was nothing, or it's just a good place to send your internal opponents and allow them to either die or become basically neutered. Often those who resisted the kolkhozes most desperately and most intensely would even destroy their own goods, their own produce, kill their own livestock, eat them until they could no longer eat them, and basically just burn the carcasses just to keep the kolkhoz from getting them. So this started to create an even bigger problem. It was doing the opposite of solving the grain crisis. And so it was partly due to these kind of the side effects of the resistance and the reorganization, but it was also partly due to an intentional policy by the Soviet government to starve out its enemies. There was a horrid famine, worst famine in Russian history, in the Ukraine, especially from 1932 to 1933, and once again, statistics are really hard to come by, reliable statistics, but something between 6 and 20 million people were killed as a whole in both the famine and just the pure violence of collectivization combined. Collectivization was successful if you are only counting, did it achieve what it set out to do? Bring the peasants together, away from individual farms and kind of put them under state control. To the extent that it was as much an issue of social control as economic efficiency, then you probably would have to say that collectivization was successful. It also allowed the government to shift resources, because now it controlled agricultural output, and allowed the government to shift those resources towards the cities where it could be used, where these resources could be used for industrialization. So a lot of the grain that was requisitioned forcibly from the peasants was potentially exported or just sold by the government. At the same time, in terms of actual food production, collectivization was a massive failure. It took until 1935 for grain production to get back up to its 1930 level. So 5 years to basically be back at the same place, not much of a success. And if you look at livestock, it wasn't even until I think the 1950s that livestock got back to where it had been in 1930. And this, I guess, largely to a large extent because it takes a lot longer to rebuild up herds once they've all been slaughtered. Next issue, the purges. As mentioned, Stalin was first among equals in 1929, but he still was not unassailable. He was not. He wasn't, say, a classic all-powerful dictator. There was resistance against his ideas in the Politburo, in the Central Committee, and in the powerful state bodies. Some of his policies, specifically collectivization and industrialization, were unpopular because they had so many people were suffering as a result of them, and their success was currently in doubt. Not that success necessarily happened, but there were already problems. And one of the things that kind of kicked off, probably the thing that kicked off Stalin's true gaining of a vice grip on power were purges. The Russian word for purge is chistka, which is basically it means a cleansing or a cleaning. So you can get the idea that that people removed by purges, by being, say, expelled from the party, by being pulled out of their offices, that is, pulled out of their official roles. They presented a danger like an infection to the Communist Party as a whole. And there had been other rounds of purges before the 1930s. Lenin had purged the party sometimes. In the early 20s, there'd been more purges, but these had usually been, relatively legitimate purges. People who were drunkards, people who were, actually were ideologically suspect, people who were careerists, who were not interested in Marxism or communism. And these people had been taken out of the party, but in general, there hadn't been physical violence done to them. All this starts to change in the 30s. Now, Stalin had a friend, Sergei Kirov, who was well liked by everyone. He was a moderate, friendly person. He was the boss of Leningrad by this time. And Kirov was one of the top, definitely one of the top 10, maybe top 5 communists at this point in the country. And he went to the party congress, which these are the big all-party gatherings that occurred every 3, 4, 5 years in those days. And when the top communists were to be elected to, say, the Central Committee or other kind of high decision-making bodies, there would be a vote. And Kirov gave a speech to great acclamation, huge rounds of applause. People were actually showed him a lot more love than they did Stalin, both in terms of their public reaction to the speech and in terms of the way they voted for him. And if you know one thing about Stalin, it's that this is not something he's going to like. And Stalin had a love-hate relationship with other people anyway. So even though Kirov is, at times one of Stalin's friends, to the extent that Kirov can have great friends, Kirov, very strangely, suspicious circumstances, potential witnesses keep showing up dead, and say weird car accidents and that kind of thing. Kirov is assassinated. Stalin claimed this was part of a plot to overthrow him, to overthrow communist rule, and started and sent the NKVD, which is the new name for the secret police, gave the NKVD basically free license to do whatever it needed, or really whatever it wanted, in order to find the people involved, in air quotation marks that you can't see, in this conspiracy. So they shot a good many party members. This is the first real type of violence inflicted within the party, and thousands more were arrested. This seemed to not be becoming a continuing thing, but by 1935, 1936, Stalin got the ball rolling again. He put on a series of show trials, which is what they were called, because they weren't real trials. They were just for show. Everyone knew exactly what was going to happen. Everyone knew what was expected of them. People were kind of playing their roles, even if they knew what they were saying was just lines with no truth behind it. And now is when the other top officials, the people who were called the old Bolsheviks, who knew Lenin, who were around for the 1905 revolution or the 1917 revolutions, when these people basically begin to be completely picked off. Here you see Zinoviev, who you may remember was one of the top 4 or 5 officials at the death of Lenin. And he and other people were accused of ridiculous things, things like being part of a counter-revolutionary conspiracy with the French and the British in the pay of the Japanese to assassinate Stalin and, say, the great artistic figures of the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, they generally admitted to whatever they were accused of, because they were being tortured, their families were being threatened. The authorities would say, well, admit to whatever we've accused you of, or you might find out that your son and your wife and your daughter will also all be accused of things, and they'll go to Siberia or they'll be executed. So almost everybody basically confessed publicly to whatever they were accused of. And execution would generally come within hours. People would just be shot in their jail cells. And there were a series of about 3 big show trials with 16, 17, 18 defendants each, in 36, 37, and 38. And here you have all the top old Bolsheviks: Kamenev, Zinoviev, Bukharin, Yagoda, who funnily enough, he kind of got what was coming to him. He was the guy who ran the first two show trials. Marshal Tukhachevsky, who you may remember as General Tukhachevsky back during the Russo-Polish War. Basically, anyone who knew things about what Stalin was like before the revolution, before he kind of rose to power, was done away with. And this spread. I guess all these accusations, denunciations from the top started to trickle down and trickle outward. Lower ranking people and mid-level people and technicians, the engineers, a lot of the officials, especially in Ukraine or in other kind of suspect regions, found themselves targeted by denunciations like this, accusations of being spies for foreign powers or the capitalists. A lot of them were executed, more than 1 million, and many more ended up in the vast chain of labor camps called the Gulag, stretching throughout Russia. A lot of the time, their family members, people's family members, would be sent there as well. And this was not an ordinary jail. This was a kind of situation of massive deprivation, near starvation, rations, horrible infectious disease problems, and a very high number of the people sent to the Gulag ended up dying of malnutrition, exposure, disease, that kind of thing. It spread also into the military. The Red Army lost 50% of its officers. It lost most of its top officers, especially the Navy, lost all 8 of its admirals. And you can imagine with World War II just around the corner, this is one of the reasons that Russia does so poorly in the very beginning of their participation in the war, because most of the people who'd shown any military excellence had either just been executed or were in Siberia working in the Gulag. And in fact, a lot of Stalin pulled a lot of top officers out of the labor camps once the Nazis invaded, and they eventually managed to shape the Red Army up. But a huge loss for the USSR. And even outside official areas, just normal everyday people would get in on the act and denounce each other, denounce their families. There was known as the Great Terror because you never knew what would happen. You couldn't talk to anybody. You could be considered a spy for making a joke about Stalin, say, and find yourself executed or off in Siberia before you knew it. Stalin did eventually kind of pull back from this policy, but by then, as the stats, and again the stats are it's hard to say exactly how reliable they are. There's a wide range. It used to be that many millions more were thought killed or sent to the Gulag, but more recent data from the kind of opened up Soviet archives after the end of the Cold War shows that maybe 1 million dead and several million in the Gulag is more reliable. Also, as you can see from the pictures, there's one difference between the two pictures. On the left, you've got Yezhov, the guy who ran the Great Terror, and on the right, he suddenly disappeared. Exact same picture, but they photoshopped him right out of there because he was basically erased from history. I'm told that art historians actually refer to him as the vanishing commissar because in picture after picture, he's been excised, and you can only find him in a few versions of the old original pictures. Unfortunately, he was replaced by Beria, who was even more of a bad person. But as luck would have it, after Stalin dies, everybody basically turns on Beria and executes him. So, bad things happen to bad people too. It's not just bad things happening to good people in the Soviet Union. So that's something to be happy about, kind of, but not really.